child away to a hell dimension, which kind of makes anything bad that happened to even a child would look like it wasn't that bad. Wesley's later nervous inspection of the volume's illustrations of Satan chewing on Judas Iscariot suggests to the viewer that these past betrayals deeply trouble his conscience and hint at some future effort at redemption, which in fact does later come in the same season. Comedic works also employ Dante's Inferno. In episode 22 of season 5 of How I Met Your Mother, Ted Mosby ditches his friends to attend a swanky party of intellectuals. While there, he recites part of the first canto, and while doing so, realizes that he may at times act pretentiously and need his friends to rein him in when he does. Even Saturday Night Live borrowed Dante for its send-up of the 2012 vice presidential debates. In this skit, while discussing the unemployment crisis, the fictional Joe Biden, played by Jason Sudeikis, describes his hometown of Scranton like so, quote, if you went to the little circles of hell, you would still be 45 minutes outside of Scranton. Oh, there's no one here for Scranton. With this reference, Saturday Night Live manages to poke fun at the vice president's frequent negative portrayals of Scranton and his reputation for making somewhat exaggerated statements. So why use allusions to Dante to explore the character's psychology in this particular way? All these references appear on shows that center on male protagonists, and while each allusion may not target that protagonist specifically, they always relate to either the protagonist or a male character. This is significant because, as Martin notes, much of the programming associated with the third golden age of television centers on deeply flawed and confused male anti-heroes. Martin writes, these were men in recognizable struggle. They belonged to a species you might call man beset or man harried, badgered and bothered and thwarted by the modern world. And they're often presented as sort of an everyman character, which is weird considering some of them are criminals, but that's how it goes. In fact, Dante the Pilgrim could perhaps be viewed as an early forerunner of this type of character. His travels through the other world result from a crisis that stems from some type of error, which his text often mentions. Man's constant struggle to control and give in to his wild, baser instincts lies at the heart of many programs associated with the Third Golden Age. Along similar lines, the souls who Dante the Pilgrim encounters in hell have engaged in that same battle and lost. Curious viewers of the final programs who feature allusions to Dante may wonder whether a similar fate might befall Mad Men's Don Draper. Mad Men was created by Matthew Weiner, who, prior to inventing the fictional world of Don Draper, worked on The Sopranos. Set in an advertising agency during the 1960s, Mad Men follows the tumultuous life of Don Draper unfolding against the backdrop of one of modern history's most tumultuous decades. The show debuted on July 19, 2007, and quickly established itself as one of television's most acclaimed programs. In fact, Mad Men would go on to win 4 consecutive Emmy Awards for Best Drama during its 6-year run. When the viewer first meets Don Draper, we learn that he is employed as the creative director at the Sterling Cooper Advertising Agency. Don is married to a former model, Betty, and has 2 children. By season 3, the Drapers decide to dissolve their marriage, just as the employees of the former Sterling Cooper opt to dissolve the firm in favor of creating a new one, which is called Sterling Cooper, Draper & Price. By season 6, Don has weathered a bout of post-divorce depression, remarried an aspiring actress, and merged SCDP with another firm, Cutler, Gleason & Shaw, to create Sterling Cooper & Partners. Throughout this entire time, our hero has kept a major secret from nearly everyone. He is not, in fact, Don Draper, but rather Dick Whitman. Dick Whitman stole Don Draper's identity during the Korean War by switching dog tags with him following an explosion which injured Dick and killed the real Don Draper. By season 6, Don/Dick is about to descend into alcoholism, engage in a reckless affair with a neighbor, become estranged from his teenage daughter, possibly lose his wife, and definitely lose his job, all while living through 1968. He's also about to develop an interest in Dante. It is during this season of the show that we discover several allusions to the Inferno. These references tell the audience that Don's identity has reached a crisis point. He must either reconcile his past and present selves, or remain caught in a vicious cycle of self-destruction that closely resembles the Inferno.
And the poster for season 6 kind of alludes to that, where you see the 2 images of Don Draper walking in opposite directions.
Season 6 of Mad Men begins with a woman's piercing scream, which opens onto a point-of-view shot. The scene unfolds in soft focus as the audience watches from the perspective of someone who we can tell from the angle the camera is lying on the floor. We first see the worried face of Don Draper's wife standing over the unknown person, and then we glimpse a new face which belongs to an unidentified doctor who offers medical assistance. This initial scene dissolves into a shot of Don Draper reclining on a beach, reading a paperback edition of The Inferno. A voiceover in Don's unmistakable baritone intones the comedy's first line. In the middle of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood where the straight way was lost. This curious beginning leaves the audience confused. We do not know whether the person who we saw having a heart attack in the opening shot was Don Draper or someone else. Hence, when we see Don on the beach, we are uncertain as to whether this is a memory to an earlier time or the beginning of a fantasy sequence. This way of juxtaposing the scenes recreates the same kind of dreamlike quality at which the opening lines of Dante's convent hit, "I came to myself in a dark room." In addition, we also see a copy of Dante's text and hear one of its most celebrated quotations. Since the poem begins with Dante the pilgrim in crisis, its use in this episode foreshadows that Don Draper is about to undergo some type of similar crisis. Although we don't yet know what the nature of this crisis will be, the episode soon provides us with a clue. Later that night, Later that night, as Don sits in the hotel bar, he encounters Private First Class Dinkins, a young soldier on leave from Vietnam for his wedding. Dinkins strikes up a conversation with Don when he notices that the latter has the same military-issued lighter as him. That lighter, of course, recalls the fiery explosion that led to the rebirth of Dick Whitman as Don Draper nearly 20 years earlier. In a callback to that particular plot point, Don Draper and Private Dinkins accidentally switch lighters, reminding the astute viewer of Dick Whitman's switching of his dog tags with those of the original Don Draper. Dante makes another appearance in the second part of The Doorway, as Don and his wife Megan bring in 1968 with their neighbors Arnold and Sylvia Rosen. A snowstorm blows in over New York City. Arnold, the heart surgeon, is called away on an emergency, so Don walks him out. However, when our hero turns to head back upstairs, he doesn't go to his own apartment, but rather to the Rosen's place. He meets with Sylvia, and we are mildly shocked, but not really that shocked, to learn that they had in fact been engaging in a clandestine affair. As they are about to make love, Sylvia asks, quote, "Did you read my Dante?" unquote. Sylvia, as the owner of Don's copy of the Inferno, does not seem coincidental. Her name, Sylvia, in fact derives from the Latin word for forest, silva. So once again, we note another allusion to the Inferno's first canto and its dark wood. This same episode also references Don's fractured identity in an earlier scene. When he prepares to pose in his office for a company photograph, the photographer tells him to, quote, "Just be yourself," as the camera zooms into a mid-close-up of Don's confused face. For him, the photographer's advice is rife with many different meanings. However, Mad Men has not finished telling us about Don's personal crisis and confused identity. While his affair with Sylvia does burn passionately, it does not burn for long. As we arrive at the episode Man with a Plan, which takes place in June of 1968, Sylvia and Don are about to arrive at the end of their time together as a couple. While Don works on an ad campaign for Chevrolet, Sylvia calls and demands to see him. They meet in a Manhattan hotel where Sylvia will spend the next day or so as Don pops in and out in between work obligations. Curiously, the camera cuts to 4 separate close-ups of the hotel room door. Once when the couple arrives, twice again when Don sends Sylvia a package and she opens the door to collect it and then closes the door to head back inside. And finally when they depart the room for good at the end of the episode. The number inscribed on the door is 503. Given that Matthew Weiner, creator of The Mad World, previously wrote for The Sopranos, where, it must be recalled, also used the number stenciled on hotel room doors with the Inferno, the 503 of Don and Sylvia's room seems immediately suspicious. However, it's not in this episode, the one that follows, where we begin to understand what the number could possibly mean. In that follow-up episode, Sylvia has already ended the affair with Don, but he has not taken the news well. In fact, the crash opens with Don facing outside Sylvia's door and eavesdropping on her conversations with her husband. She realizes what he's been doing when Arnold discovers cigarette butts scattered outside the threshold. An angry Sylvia calls Don at work to effectively tell him to leave her alone. During the conversation, she speaks about what her husband might do if he were to learn of their affair. She imagines, quote, "He'll murder me and then he'll murder you," quote, in an apparent reference to the fate of Paolo and Francesca, the tragic lovers Dante meets in Canto 5. The rest of the episode slides between Don's present and Sterling Cooper in flashbacks to his past, where he recalls his first sexual encounter with Amy, a prostitute who worked at the brothel where he grew up. As he recalls his time with Amy, he remembers her painting a beauty mark on her face in the same spot where his erstwhile present-day lover Sylvia has a similar mark. So it would appear that Don's obsession with Sylvia in 1968 stems from his need to reconcile with relics from his past as Dick Whitman. In this context, the 503 stenciled on his hotel room door at Man with a Plan seems like it could represent the number 8. It will be recalled that the 8th circle punishes several subcategories of fraud, one of which is falsification. Among the falsifiers in Dante's Inferno, we find counterfeiters and souls such as Mira, who are in hell for assuming false identities. As Don's journey through 1968 winds to a close, his descent into alcoholism worsens, as do his marital and professional difficulties. In fact, it appears as though Don is suffering from what social psychology refers to as a discrepancy between his actual self, or his perception of who he really is, and his ideal self, or his perception of who he would ideally like to be. This type of discrepancy results in feelings of disappointment, dejection, rejection and dissatisfaction, according to the psychologist. In fact, Don appears dissatisfied with everything. As Sylvia announces her intention to end their affair, he sadly tells her, quote, "It is easy to walk away when you're satisfied," unquote. It is this dissatisfaction that motivates his extramarital affairs, drinking, and professional implosion. This season's final episode explores the last theme, when Don makes a pitch to Hershey's in the Sterling Cooper boardroom. He tells a completely invented story about happily eating Hershey bars with his father while growing up that impresses the Hershey executives. However, Don cannot sustain the lie. He breaks down in the boardroom and confesses the story of his past to all present. It is this professional blunder that costs him his job in the episode's closing moments. However, perhaps all is not lost for Don. As In Carrot ends, he drives his 3 children to Hershey, Pennsylvania for Thanksgiving. On the way, he stops before a dilapidated house and points it out to them as the place where he grew up. As the credits roll, the very popular song from the 60s, Both Sides Now, plays. Its closing words could very easily apply to Don Draper. I've looked at life from both sides now, from win and lose, and still somehow its life illusions I recall. I really don't know life at all, which seems to perhaps be a reference to him having looked at life from Don Draper, the wealthy man's point of view, and the woman's point of view. By juxtaposing several allusions to Dante's Inferno with references to Don Draper's fractured identity crisis, Mad Men informs its audience that the original error which led Don astray in a dark wood of his own was his renunciation of his past and his theft of the real Don Draper's identity. The Don of 1968 must either learn how to reconcile his past and present selves or be destined to repeat the same circle of self-destruction that we have witnessed throughout the previous 5 seasons. Without correcting this error like Dante the Pilgrim, Don will continue to metaphorically travel in circles, but unlike Dante, he will never escape from the Inferno. Will Don succeed? How will Mad Men end forever? Where will allusions to the Inferno appear next? And most interesting of all, will Dante ever receive an honorary Emmy for any of his contributions? We will only find out if we continue to tune in. Thank you.
Finally, we will hear from Peter Hoofnagel. Peter is Dean of Faculty at Miller School of Alabama, where he's been teaching English and coaching since 2005. Peter earned his BA and MA from the University of Virginia, where he studied English literature as a graduate. While in UVA, he raced for the cycling team. In 2005, he won both the ACC Cycling Road Race Championship and the ACC Team Time Trial Championship. Since graduating, Peter has continued to pursue both academics and athletics. Listen to his Dantean, or at least otherworldly combination of skills and virtues. Peter has published essays and studies in the novel, Forum for World Literature Studies, the Norton Critical Edition of the Time Machine, and the Olympics in Philosophy. He has presented at the annual Renaissance Prose Conference and spoken on Shakespeare's Roman plays at the University of Richmond's Jepson School of Leadership. In athletics, Peter pursues road cycling, mountain biking, and triathlon at an elite level. In 2007, he raced as a guest rider for the professional cycling team Colavita Sutter Home in the NRC Stage Race Tour of Virginia. Most recently, he finished 3rd in the Pro 1-2 Virginia State Championship Criterium and won the Charlottesville Olympic Distance Triathlon. In 2010, he established the Endurance Athletics Program at MSA, as well as the Virginia High School Mountain Bike Series. Peter lives in Crozet with his wife, Andrea Dvorak, who is a former collegiate triathlon national champion and currently one of the nation's top-ranked professional cyclists. She was named to the 2012 USA Olympic Lawn Team for Cycling and represented the USA at World Championships in 2012 and 2013. I give you Peter Hoofnagel and his paper, To Hell with Teenagers, Teaching the Inferno in Secondary School.
Thanks for that nice introduction. Promising to be a fight and won't require doing exercise during this. A lot of athletics in there. That's great. It's a real honor to be here speaking at UVA. I always considered studying here one of the great privileges of my life. So those of you who are students here right now, enjoy it. It's the paradise of Dante's world, at least. I studied here, I studied the epic, really learned the epic from James Dornberg and Paul Kanner, who are here in the audience, and took most of the classes that they offered. So my instruction of the Inferno at the high school level is informed by what I learned here at UVA, and it's sometimes funny when my students go on and study here and actually take classes with Paul, who still teaches here. They come back and say, you know, you actually just took all the stuff he taught you and taught it, repackaged it, and taught it to us. And I said, you're darn right I did. I'm proud of that. So my talk today is a little bit different than most, and I think I'm a little bit different than some of the presenters, in that I'm not a Dante scholar, but I have been fairly successful opening the gates of hell to teenagers over the past 10 years. I teach 10th grade English at Miller School of Albemarle, which is a co-ed boarding school and day school right up the road. So I'm teaching the Inferno to 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds. And more often than not, I'm introducing them to the poem for the first time. However, I'm going to talk about how I'm not introducing them to Dante or the Inferno for the first time. So it's really a kind of an honor to do that. And hopefully I spark in them an interest that then when they go on to college and they read the Inferno, they become Italian majors or conflict majors. Before I start also, I want to commend Deborah and Mark Parker on their book, The Inferno Revealed. If you haven't picked that up, it is fantastic. Its ability to concisely and clearly explain the world of the Divine Comedy to a general reader is just fantastic. So way to go on. I know I'll use it in class moving forward. One other side note before I really get going. In addition to teaching and coaching at Miller School, I'm also the director of discipline. So I think it's kind of appropriate that I'm the guy who gets to teach the Inferno because I'm accustomed to handing out penalties. And really the world of discipline at Miller School is kind of the world of Dante. And you do one thing, you go one place. I'm oftentimes tempted to pull down Botticelli's map and say, you know, if you keep on this track, this is where you might end up. So when I teach the Inferno, it falls into the curriculum with the other epics that I teach. The 10th grade English class is a course on epic poetry, and it starts with Homer's Iliad, and really marches right on through to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So it's a big course in terms of what we cover. What this means is I can't teach the entire Inferno. And that's one of the things that high school teachers need to be aware of, and need to be okay with. It's okay to teach part of a poem, to get the kids interested in it, to teach them what goes on in general, and then hopefully they'll continue reading it on their own, or at least have an appetite for it moving forward. So with the Inferno, I teach the first 6 cantos. And before they read the Inferno, they've read Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid. Again, just parts of those poems, but they do have a good feeling of Homer and a good feeling for Virgil. So then I use Dante's Inferno as a way to introduce the Middle Ages and take them into the Renaissance. So I actually begin the study of Dante as a work of medieval literature, and in the study of Dante as considering Dante and the Inferno as a work that takes us into the Renaissance, or at least is forward-looking and considering some of the ideas of the Renaissance. One clicker here. Divine Comedy and video games. Now, while I'm the first person to introduce them to the real poem, students come into the Inferno actually with a pretty good understanding of how the Inferno is organized. And so I use their background knowledge on video games to help them understand that Dante's world and the structure of Dante's world actually has a lot in common with popular culture and new media. Specifically, we talk about medieval scholasticism and how in the Middle Ages there is this desire and need to organize things And that makes sense, because in the Middle Ages, with the prominence of the Catholic Church, the world has been ordered by God. So God has created a very structured system, and it makes sense then that hell would be structured as well. And they get this. They really understand this idea of organizing something and the idea of a mastermind being in control of the world. Because masterminds are the ones who make the worlds of video games. Yes, the character moves through the video game. Yes, the teenager who plays the video game has some control. But at the end of the day, the video game designer has laid everything out. Every possibility is a result of the initial design. And that's exactly what the Catholic Church and the teachings of the Church would hope, I think, to teach people that the path in life, you have some choices, but ultimately the framework for your life and the afterlife has been predetermined. So there's sort of a great image of an earlier video game where you have all these different levels. And students get this. They work through these levels playing games, and therefore they understand kind of the world of the Inferno. We take this one step further, though, in that a lot of high school students have not only played video games, they've played the Inferno. They've actually been Dante and worked through the afterlife. And Professor Cantor showed a clip from the film adaptation, or the animated film version of the video game. It's pretty funny. But they're used to this. They've been Dante. I'm not sure who he's killing here. Some people in the audience can tell me. Now this gets to the second point, though, with the Middle Ages. Again, we've done all this before we actually go into the poem. These students have read the Iliad and the Aeneid. They know the epic hero. When they think epic heroism, they think Achilles and they think Aeneas. So the virtues that go along with Achilles would include things like Greek arete, physical virtue, spiritedness, this idea of Greek thumos. But they think of someone who's independent and who's someone who changes the world around him. The world of the Iliad is fundamentally different because Achilles exists. The war changes because of one man. Likewise, in the Aeneid, they've introduced this hero Aeneas, who exemplifies Roman auctoritas, Roman pietas, gravitas, being serious and noble in the most dangerous of situations, and someone who literally founds a city, who starts a new race, people who change the world. So that's what they're expecting when they go into the Inferno, and the video game gives us an idea that Dante, the character, is going to fit the bill. He's going to be this strange combination of Achilles, of Aeneas, of Lancelot, and the video game makers understand this as well. However, they don't get this guy. They don't put up the poem. They get this guy. And at first this confuses them a little bit. There is Dante cowering behind Virgil. And just in the first two books of the Inferno, Dante cries a lot. He faints a couple times. From Mandelbaum's translation here, and just so you know, I use Mandelbaum's translation because one, I think it's beautiful, and two, it has the Italian next to it, and while I don't speak Italian, my students mostly don't speak Italian, I think it's really great that they can look over and just compare word choices. So is Dante using the word lust or love when he's dealing with Paolo and Francesca in the original Italian, for example? So to read you, here sighs, lamentations and loud cries were echoing across the starless air, so that as soon as I set out, I wept. Dante's a wimp. Yes, he's going through hell and seeing some pretty scary things, but at the end of the day, he's not Achilles. He's not Aeneas. Yeah, Achilles cries in the Iliad, but it's after killing Hector and he's dragging Hector's body around, and he's crying for Patroclus. I mean, it's a cool cry. This guy's cry isn't so cool. But that gets to the point of what's going on here in the Middle Ages. And it gets to the point of the transformation of heroism that takes place under the sponsorship of Christianity. And for a high school student, That's crucial to understand that point in order to understand where literature goes. You know, we're never going to get to William Wordsworth and Tintern Abbey. We actually don't understand that there's a fundamental shift in heroism, in the nature of heroism in literature that takes place largely because of Christianity. So we see Dante not as an Achilles figure, not as an Aeneas figure, but as an everyman figure. You know that morality play, he kind of fits that bill. Just about anybody could take the role of Dante and be led through the underworld. It doesn't require any specific set of virtues. It requires moral virtue, and it requires someone who's willing to be guided on the right spiritual path. And that really does kind of get to the heart of what it means to introduce the students, at least, to the Middle Ages. The hero is no longer someone who changes the world around him. Rather, the hero now is someone who is changed by the world. And Dante is changed by Beatrice, and he's changed by his experience going through all the different levels of the afterlife. So for the first week of the class, that's what we focus on. I kind of hook their attention with the video game stuff. They know epic heroism from what they've read previously, but then we throw them into the Middle Ages and show them this, how things change. And they get that, they appreciate it, they understand it. And in fact, at the end of the day, Dante, the character, as a hero, has more in common with movie heroes and TV heroes than Achilles and Aeneas do. Then we change gears. I was glad to see Deborah stand up for Dan Brown last night. I'm actually kind of a Dan Brown fan. I never sort of felt guilty about it until I read all those terrible reviews and be like, ugh. Maybe I shouldn't be advertising that I like this guy's books, but they're page turners. And if nothing else, they spark an interest to get people to study Da Vinci, to study the Divine Comedy. I know my own father read The Inferno for the first time after reading Dan Brown's Inferno. And just to offer a little bit of evidence that I really do like Dan Brown, I actually own the illustrated edition of the Da Vinci Code, which my wife bought me because she knew I liked the non-illustrated version. It's pretty good. But I don't bring up the Da Vinci Code because high school students today actually aren't familiar with Dan Brown like they would have been 10 years ago. But I do approach studying the Inferno, the second half of our study, kind of through a Dan Brownish lens, in that we look at Dante not as the supreme representative of the Middle Ages, rather as someone who's forward-looking and someone who is a rebel. Of course, young people like this idea. They like the idea that a canonical author, Dante, this guy's, as we learned in the previous presentation, in Italy, Catholic schools are saying, we need to teach Dante. This guy supports Catholic teaching. But in fact, Dante in his own time was a real rebel. De Monarchia was blacklisted by the Catholic Church. They probably would have blacklisted the Inferno if it wasn't so wildly popular. He was banished from Florence for political reasons. He was regarded by many as a religious heretic. So what I talk about with the students is sometimes when we look at things from a bird's eye view, we get the idea that Dante is completely canonical, and that Dante is this great representative of the Middle Ages. However, when we dive into the poem and look at some of the undercurrents in the poem, we learn that maybe he's a secret writer. Maybe he's like Da Vinci in Dan Brown's most popular novel. Maybe he's actually going against the current, and there's some real risque stuff happening. So how do we do this? Again, we only read the first 6 books. So how can we kind of unravel the Dante Code in 6 books? Well, we look at limbo specifically. And we look at who Dante places in limbo and why they are there. So for example, I have the kids go research Averroes and find out, where would this guy be placed in the map of hell. He's a Muslim, born way after Christ. And they all come back, try to do their homework, they're good students, and tell me what circle of hell he belongs in. And then we read the canto where Dante goes into limbo and find, hey, Averroes and guys like Saladin are right there with a lot of these figures who were born before Christ, therefore didn't have the opportunity to be Christians. Furthermore, we look at limbo and say, okay, it makes sense that Dante's throwing all these guys in hell. You know, they didn't believe in Christ, and they're not Christians, they're pagans. But once we get in there, I think Dante would have stayed, Dante the character, if given the opportunity. Now think about this. It's kind of this philosophical paradise for the greatest philosophical minds of the ancient world. You got Ovid, you have Horace, you have Homer, Virgil's there with Dante, and Dante's even invited to lunch with some of these guys. And he says, this is one of the great honors of my life, to be down here in hell. So I think Dante clearly appreciates the classical tradition. Obviously, he's writing an epic poem, but he also is sympathetic to the pagan world. He is sympathetic to great minds, regardless of whether or not they are Christian or Muslim or even pagan. The last thing we look at is the Apollo and Francesca episode. You have to have kids read that. It's probably one of the most famous parts of the whole poem. And as director of discipline, I sort of will leave you with this. It's a boarding school. Kids can't, boys have to stay away from the girls' rooms and vice versa. And I say, if I were to catch one of you guys in the same room together, what would the penalty be? And very few of them raise their hand and say, well, obviously it would make us spend eternity together. Naked, and as we saw in the film, full frontal nudity naked, floating around. So I hope to spark an interest in the students that they can look at this poem and look at Dante as both the supreme representative of the Middle Ages, but also as this rebel who is forward-thinking in ways that only close analysis of the text will unfold.
Well, we'll have a short period for questions, as this is the coffee break from now to 11:30. But let's take some questions and invite our panelists, if they'd like, to come up to the table. Peter, Dwayne, and Sarah.
I really enjoyed all three talks very much, but since you're going around then, Peter, are you going to be using the Dan Brown's Inferno? And because I know you've read it, and
Yeah.
if you are, can you give us a sense of how you're going to use it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I kind of asked you a similar question last night. In that I was really excited for this book to come out. Kind of anxious for it to come out. And I think there are some things that I can pull from it. And I made notes in the book, but it didn't quite have that Da Vinci Code piece that I was hoping for in terms of you solve the problem by close textual analysis, the way the main character solved the problems through analyzing these paintings as an art historian. So it's not as obvious and as easy as I hoped it was going to be. And the kids haven't read it the way I kind of hoped they would have coming into this year. But I wanted to be like, Dan Brown, we're doing the Inferno, and have all the kids like, I read the Inferno over the summer. So I'm still looking for ways to do it, and it's kind of not clearly laid out as I hoped.
I have another question. This one's for Sarah. Someone else I know at University of Texas teaches a course on the afterlife of Dante's Inferno. And I think there's bit on Dante and TV, and there was one TV show that is on this, I think this guy mentions, and I wonder if you're familiar with it. It's quite different than all the examples that you show, but this is from Sex and the City, and there's Samantha at one point takes on a lover named Dante. Have you heard of anything? I haven't seen that, so I just don't know what's going on there.
I haven't ever actually seen, well, I've seen Sex and the City, but not that much of it, so I don't know specifically about her having a boyfriend named Dante, but that wouldn't be really that surprising, because Sex and the City is sort of considered, if you think about the third golden age of television, The Sopranos is considered the program that kicks that off for dramatic shows, and then Sex and the City is sort of the one that kicks it off for the more comedic shows. So it would kind of make sense to me that they might also bring Dante into it, and it would make sense to me actually that they would maybe connect it to Samantha of all the other characters, because she's the one that's said to be, I mean, Kim Cattrall describes her as being like a female man, which is funny because she does things that stereotypically are always considered male behaviors. So it would kind of make sense that she might have some connection to Dante somewhere in there.
I had a question for Sarah as well. I was so intrigued with your paper and these intricate, subtle layers of connection in these TV shows. And I was most curious about the room number. I think it was the Sopranos episode. Does the writer or producer, director, did they actually say, you know, in designing this room, these numbers connect to?
I've not yet found anything where David Chase specifically says that, but there are quotes from him when he talks about his educational background, and he talks about how when he went to college, he at that point read the kind of classic works of Italian literature like Boccaccio and Dante, and he says things like, I finally understood he says he understood why his family was so crazy, basically, because he